Everybody, welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, March 23rd of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a handful of questions on tap here for us. We'll talk a little bit about overall the general SaberSim process. A couple notes on opportunities to add value, and also the value of at times maybe just kind of letting the Sims do what they do best. We'll talk a little bit about, I saw a question here about increasing your diversity here, or specifically increasing the size of your player pool. A couple questions about, or at least one question about duplication here. Leverage, a couple questions it looks like too. Also, that will be a little bit more opportunities to do some tutorials or show off some a couple different things in the entry editor. So a lot on our plates here for today. As always, if you have questions, go ahead and get them into the queue now by asking them into YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack. We answer questions here in roughly chronological order. I always say roughly chronological order because sometimes I'll kind of pick and choose if I see one that pops in that I think is a good follow-up from the whatever we're talking about, but roughly chronological order. So the sooner you get your question in, the sooner we get to it. But let's go ahead and dive in here, not waste any time. We're actually going to start here with a couple questions that came in through our support inbox that I think are a good way to kick the show off. So let's get this one in first here. First question here. Says, what's the best way to build lineups? Start with stars, or lock in a core of cheaper players first. So one of the cool things that's going on with SaberSim, or actually let me back up and talk about this from the other direction here. A lot of times you have these rules of thumb that you'll hear around the industry that say something like the best way to build NBA lineups are to start with your stars. Or to start with the value and then build from there. And these rules of thumb have evolved primarily because traditional optimizers don't actually deal very well with the problem of finding upside in your lineups, right? They don't build lineups that have upside on their own. You either need to set rules or groups or curate a player pool or have a process where you're selecting a certain set of players to go into the lineup first or be your player pool so that the lineup optimizer does not just print you a bunch of cash lineups, right? So that it has some way of getting upside, right? And this could be a variety of different things. You hear it constantly and in a bunch of different ways. You'll hear, start with the value, start with the studs, start with your low-owned plays, start with your big fades, right? All of that comes from the fact that on its own, the builder, the tool you're using, the lineup optimizer, traditional optimizer, won't build you high upside lineups. Because SaberSim is using simulations to build lineups, right? And I say that all the time, but I actually want to go one step deeper here. Because we're not using average projections when you're building your lineups that you are getting are naturally going to be optimal for a set of outcomes that can actually happen. Right there, when I say optimal, I'm saying that is the highest upside lineup that could be created from a given set of outcomes. And that is literally what happens when you build your lineups with SaberSim, right? This sim variance slider here will control the bucket of how many simulations are we looking at from our entire set of, say, 10,000 simulations for every game on the slate. How big is that bucket of simulations? Right? How many sims are we looking at? And then when we build the lineups, we'll pull a random set of sims that size and build the highest scoring lineup we can. Along with, these other factors come into play where we're also taking into account correlation and ownership. But in a nutshell, at the most basic level, that's what's happening here. So the practical impact of that is that you can rest assured, essentially, that your constructions that you are getting out of your lineups without doing any rules, including starting with your stars or locking in core players first, are still going to have upside. And actually, even one step further, they are going to live in the correct context of the slate and the contest sizing that we're talking about here, right? I mentioned the flaws with traditional optimizer at the start of this question. That the second part of this, I guess, or an entire different problem with these rules of thumb here is that they don't account for different slates, right? They don't account, what if on a certain slate there is a ton of really cheap value and it's very easy to get stars? What if most of the values in the 6 and 7K range and it's very hard to build anything other than balanced lineups? It also doesn't account for contest context, right? Your approach or your optimal strategy that you would use in the big flagship GPP might be very different than playing a small field single entry. So On the practical side, what should we do instead, right? Let's answer this question. What's the best way to build lineups? If you are sitting down to build your lineups for any sport, any slate on SaberSim, the first thing I always recommend you end up doing is leaving step one alone. Leave the projections and the ownership and the exposures and everything on step one alone. Go to step two. Tell us what contest you are building your lineups for. And you will see there is a material difference of what the optimal strategies are for very large field contests versus much smaller single entry contests, right? So tell us what contest you're trying to build lineups for. But, let's say it's something like a 20 max, 10 to 50K, right? And then build what we call a test build. We're going to change no settings. And this will help you understand what left basically to SaberSim's own devices, what we think the optimal way to play that slate is for this particular contest at that point in time, right? Obviously, with NBA, news can change a lot throughout the day. Things can change quite a bit in terms of what is the optimal strategy. And go in here, and what I typically like to do is we'll adjust two projections here so that we can see our lineups. Is look to see, particularly the outliers, I would say. So you can sort these columns and you can look and see how is SaberSim handling the different outliers on the slate, right? What are your highest exposure players, right? Those might be good opportunities of players to look into to figure out why, like what is the projection? Why am I getting so many of these guys, right? Look and see what the highest value plays are. Right? Here's an interesting one. Very interesting. If you were just looking and studying average projections, Damian Jones, 7x value. Well, why are we not getting any of him, right? Well, you can get 45 points at 7x value from Spencer Dinwiddie, right? And you're only getting 27 points at 7x value from Damian Jones, right? Or, what maybe another reason why we're getting that is because a lot of the best pay up options are at the center position or something like that, right? Look at how you're navigating the chalk, right? What are we doing with the chalkiest plays on the slate? Well, we're getting some positive leverage on Dinwiddie, Reggie Bullock, Davion Mitchell, full fade of RJ Barrett, our fourth chalkiest player at the moment, the way we're projecting it, right? What are your highest and lowest leverage stands? What are the plays that we're most over the field on? We think there's a big ownership inefficiency with someone like Joel Embiid at the moment here, right? What are our biggest fades, right? We just said RJ Barrett, but it also looks like Brunson. We're very in on the Dinwiddie side versus the Brunson side, right? From there's a lot of opportunities of ways you can add value, right? That may come from going in a little bit closer into your research for these individual players, like looking at why am I getting so much Dinwiddie and no Brunson, right? That's, I think, an interesting question that pops into my head, at least at the moment here. Why am I getting 100% or virtually 100% Obi Toppin and 0% RJ Barrett, right? Another interesting question. It gives you opportunities. I also think there's value that can be added in purely just adjusting your exposures here. But I guess the overall point I am making is that it is a bit of a shift, but with SaberSim, you don't need to come into a slate and the first thing you think, what is my approach going to be? Or what is my process going to be? Or what are the rules and groups that I'm going to have to set to be successful here, right? Start with stars or lock in a core of cheaper players first is kind of essentially like a process or a rule that you'd be following. And you don't really need to think about that because the constructions themselves will be handled for you. Because again, even you take any random lineup out of this pool and we know that it is optimal for a certain set of simulations of the game, for a certain set of simulations of the slate, right? There is a outcome for which this lineup is the optimal lineup on the slate tonight. So again, that's kind of how I would think about as you sit down to build your lineups for any slate, right? This could be basketball, this could be NASCAR, this could be MMA. Start with the test build. Don't worry about what the rules and groups and things and process that you're going to have to put in for that particular slate to build good lineups, because that part's handled for you. Run the test build, look at kind of what players you're getting, look at what kind of constructions you're getting, and you can vary and tweak from there using the test build as kind of that grounding, that entry point into the slate. If you ran this, just to compare, if you ran this on a traditional tool with average projections, all you would get out of it were the cash lineups for that night. You basically, if you built 20 lineups on a traditional optimizer with no input whatsoever, it would really tell you nothing about the optimal strategy for GPPs for that slate. It would just say, these are the best cash plays, right? You'd have to kind of individually make decisions on where good chalk versus bad chalk was, what kind of lineup constructions and where salary should be applied and things like that. And that's the part that SaberSim can kind of basically automate away for you. So with that said, I think that leads us into a good follow-up question here that also came in through support. And I think the original question was a little bit longer here, but it was kind of summarized here as, can I trust the outputs of The Sims as is and get my edge from playing a large volume of contests? Always a very interesting question when this comes in. So I am confident that by default, right, the push button print money kind of joke, I guess, that you'll see around in our Slack thing. I am confident that when you go in and build lineups on a given slate on SaberSim and specify what contest you are entering those lineups into, that your lineups on average will be positive EV, right? I believe that these are good lineups. These are profitable lineups as is, right? That is not a guarantee that you're going to bank every night. It's a high variance game. I've demonstrated that plenty of times here on stream before. But in a nutshell, yes, I believe that you can be successful adding limited value on a slate-to-slate basis here. In terms of getting your edge from playing a large volume of contests, I think this is an interesting idea, and I'm going to be kind of pedantic, I guess, in the way that I answer this. I think let me start by saying this. There is a baseline level of expected value of profitability that I think you're going to get just by using simulations and leveraging the power of SaberSim alone, basically just using the lineups that you get without making any changes. I think the ceiling of how high you can take that is much higher, right? If you are going to go in and pick specific spots and add value by adjusting projections and making the model a little bit better in specific spots, or if you're going to study the ownership projections, particularly for a specific contest, and adjust the ownership projections and be directionally accurate there, that's going to add value. That's going to raise your ceiling. You may also add a little bit of value by setting particularly or precise rules or groups in specific spots, right? Not for every team on the slate or anything like that, but in specific spots to get a little bit of an additional edge. There's also, you can do some intuitive work on step 3 here, where you're kind of going through and eliminating or specifically choosing lineups that you like for one reason or another, right? There's absolutely ways to add value. But assuming that you are going to kind of take in the baseline, basically the lineups you are getting out, you're going to let the Sims kind of do a lot of the work for you. You are not going to... Well, let me think about this. On the contest selection side, there's kind of 2 things you can do. You can optimize and get the most expected value of those lineups by playing them into the softest contests. That line of thinking is basically why we emphasize contest selection so massively in all of our content, right? If you come over to our YouTube channel here, and we'll give this just a second to load, right? This is our YouTube channel, right? Win more at NBA DFS in our 2021 course. The first video that comes up in this course, this is a contest selection video, right? You scroll down here to I know it's not football season. Oh, I took the football one off. It was the same deal for football, right? The first video that we have kind of shown people in general when you watch our content is always a contest selection video. And it's with that thinking in mind, right? If you're going to take the lineups, if you're going to kind of trust the Sims as is, or even if you are adding additional value, it is to your benefit to maximize the profitability of those lineups by playing them into the softest contests. But one thing that I think this question really gets at that I think is an interesting point and that I haven't talked a lot about on stream here before is that there's a spectrum of how many lineups you are going to play and how much time you can afford to essentially perfect them versus building a lot more lineups and spreading out your variance and getting more shots on goal, essentially. So in one hand, like if you were playing 5 lineups on a particular slate, just by the sheer fact that you're only playing 5, you would have a lot more opportunities to kind of increase the ceiling of those lineups, really optimize the lineup constructions, maybe particularly exploit a very specific edge that you feel there is on a slate, enter those into perfectly optimal contests, and you'd have a lot of time and theoretically can maximize your EV of those individual lineups. If you're playing 150 lineups or 300 lineups, you don't necessarily have that opportunity to comb over all 150 with a fine-tooth comb, but you're getting an increased advantage of getting the greatest opportunity to realize the edge that you have, right? In case one, maybe you have a 20% theoretical ROI, but you only have 5 lineups in play. In the other case, maybe you have an 8% theoretical ROI, but you have 300 lineups in play. So I think it is an interesting, thought experiment, I guess, to ask yourself, where do you lie or where do you want to lie on that spectrum overall? Are you going to be a player that really is focusing on maximizing the EV of the lineups you're playing by adding additional value, maybe really focusing on a smaller set of lineups, cherry picking those lineups into the exact best contests that you can find out there? Or are you going to, in theory, accept maybe a little bit lower theoretical ROI, but maximize or lower your variance as much as possible and maximize your return as quickly as possible, the ability to realize that edge? I fall a little bit more on this side of things. I play on any slate I'm playing. I try to play as many lineups as possible. I try to play as I try to get as many unique lineups in play as possible. And on a given slate, I am not doing as much to try to maximize or exploit an edge on that particular slate beyond what is already kind of happening here by default, right? I'm going in on an NBA slate. I'm building my lineups as close to lock as possible. I'm giving myself some late swap flexibility where it makes sense, and I'm late swapping as news comes out. And while there's probably edge to be gained by going in and studying rotations and maybe minutes and tweaking projections a little bit here or there, or tweaking ownership, I'm basically willing to sacrifice some of those maybe minor edges that I could add by adjusting things in order to get as much lineups in play. And if it came down to, studying the main slate as deeply as possible as news broke throughout the night, or just playing all the other slates throughout the night, right? I would rather play more slates, right? Like, let's say, big news breaks halfway throughout the slate and it changes the main slate, right? I think one way, if you were to only play the main slate and just play a specific set of lineups, you would have more opportunity to figure out exactly how to exploit that information that broke halfway through the slate and optimize it for your small set of like 3 to 10 or even like maybe 20 lineups. And what I'm doing instead is I am late swapping, trusting the sims that have run since that has broken, and getting ready to update my 6 p.m. turbo and my showdown slates and then late swap my main slates, right? So I'm adding less value in terms of upfront to the actual sims themselves, but I'm spreading out my variance by getting as many lineups in play as possible. So I feel like I'm kind of a little bit rambling here, and a little bit off track of the original question here. So I want to kind of reel it back in here and say that, yes, I think this is a viable way of thinking about it, is that I'm going to more trust the simulations, right? And I'm going to maximize my return by playing as many contests and unique lineups as possible. That really, I would say, is actually our kind of best practice way of how we recommend people use SaberSim, right? If you are going to use SaberSim and build a single lineup, or build a very small set of lineups, or play a limited number of slates or something like that, I think it is to your advantage to try to think about more of what are you going to do to add additional value from there, because you are losing out on the opportunity to realize your edge as quickly as possible, right? If you are not going to play in a strategy that gives you these many opportunities to realize the edge that you have, then you should figure out how you are maximizing the edge in the limited number of contests you are playing. So let me know if that kind of makes sense. Again, I feel like I was maybe a little bit rambly there, but I think this is kind of a really good question and a really strong point that is implied by this question. So anyway, to both of these guys, I will go ahead and get a recording out to you from this stream. If you have any follow-up questions for me about these concepts, feel free to just email us back and we can have a little back and forth there. But anyway, cool. All right. Let's keep it going. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into some of these next questions. There is a good one from Larson here about late swap flexibility. And get this up on stream here. And he said, if there's late news we are waiting on, can we run the sim to account for it? Meaning we leave flexibility to open spots for value that might open up later. A one-to-one swap of a player may not capture the value if it's a high dollar guy that's being replaced by some clear value. If I've already used all of those available positions already in my lineups, then I can't take advantage of the value. Yeah, so this is a really good question, especially for NBA and especially on big slates. And there are a variety of different strategies that you can use to create late swap flexibility in your lineups. I don't think there is one more than the other that I would say is always the right answer. I think this requires a little bit of slate context. But the first thing I like to do is to get an idea of what the slate actually looks like. And I think one of the best dashboards for that is the Basketball Monster player news tab. And this will kind of show you, right? We've got 11 games on tap tonight, a ton of different questionable players. But it's a good idea, I think, to be familiar, especially at lock, of what news is still pending, right? What could potentially happen that still changes the slate. A lot of this will shake out by the time the slate starts, especially some of these names here closer to the top. But it's entirely likely, or not entirely likely, entirely possible that we have, LeBron James questionable maybe in the last game of the night here. Maybe some interesting names in the Magic and Thunder game. Maybe Towns is questionable going into lock. Getting an idea of what is the likelihood, or even what is the potential chance that a big name player in the later games gets ruled out and opens up value, right? I also think it's important to run a test build to get an idea of how valuable the value is in the early games to begin with, right? So if we go back to our test build here, right, and give this a second to load back up, we can look and see who we're getting exposure to, right? But there's obviously going to be some value in this New York game. Who else is playing in the early games? Atlanta, Detroit, New York, Charlotte, and Sacramento. So some Sacramento value too, right? Actually, quite a bit of Sacramento and New York value, right? So there are certain slates where the early games will have very limited value. There won't be a lot of names popping it up early in the early games at all. In this particular slate, well, it looks like there will be some later news that has the potential to break. There is also some value in the early games. From there, once you kind of have the context for the slate, I think there's a couple different opportunities you can use here. One is you can go to the particular team or game where you think that value might show up, and just give the builder a reason to emphasize these players a little bit more. So, something that I might do is just kind of bump all of the players maybe playing in the Lakers game up, right? And we're not going to force anything by rule, but we're basically going to tell the builder, hey, like, these are good plays. That one might be a little high, right? And maybe just like 10% bumps, I think, is probably kind of appropriate here. These are all actually, I bumped these a little high, but like a 10% bump, I think, can basically tell the builder, look at these guys. These could be important names for us here. And I think this is really useful for a couple situations. If there's one particular name or player that's questionable going into the later games, right? Like maybe it is just LeBron. This can allow you to be kind of specific in the way that you build lineups, right? The other thing that's nice here is it will allow the builder some flexibility, right? By bumping up the projections of some of these guys. And you could be even more specific than this. If you have a sense of who actually the best plays become when LeBron gets ruled out, maybe you're like specifically just coming in here and bumping, Russell Westbrook or something like that up a bit. What's nice about this, though, is that it will be flexible. It basically will tell the builder, hey, against all the other value on the slate, use these guys as you see fit, but I want to allow for a little bit of flexibility in there. A more rigid way of preserving late swap flexibility in your lineups would be to set a rule or a group requiring that a certain number of players from a given team or game are used in your lineup. So one thing you could do here is go in and set a stacking rule and say something like at least 3 players from something like, go through and actually pick the teams that are playing at the end of the night. So it was Sacramento, Portland, Lakers, Philly, and so there you go. And say something like this, right? Now, what this is going to do is this is going to make sure that you have 3 players playing in the last game of the night, no matter what. Now, eventually, obviously, you don't want this rule actually in place when it comes down to the end of the slate. So eventually, you'll have to come in and delete the rule and do a late swap. And what it will do is, whenever you decide the time has come to do that, maybe it's at 6 o'clock my time, you delete the rule, you late swap, and you know that you have 3 lineup positions in every single lineup should news break. And you can decide to pull that trigger whenever you want, right? Maybe you set the rule to force 3 players from each team playing in the late game here, but the news that actually ended up breaking was Towns got ruled out a few minutes before his game started. And maybe that's the right opportunity to go in, late swap, remove the rule, and then you have a bunch of flexibility in there. Another option I think you can do as well is you can go into that test build, right? And probably should have just left this up, but you can go into the test build and take some notes about what are the actual players that are strong plays playing in the early game, right? We mentioned, let's see. So for this very first set of games, so a handful of Sacramento value, right? Quite a bit of Sacramento value, actually, and a little bit of New York value. It looks like we're kind of the best looking plays over on here. And what you can do instead is maybe come up with a list of the players that you think are useful from the early games and limit your player pool in these early games to only include those players, right? And what that's going to do is that's going to say, I'm still going to allow for these players in my builds to show up, right? I still want to take advantage of the Kings value. I still want to take advantage of the Knicks value. But if I have the opportunity between using, spending 10-4 on Trae Young or 8-9 on LaMelo Ball or 8-1 on Terry Rozier or some of these guys playing in these early games, I would rather save that salary and save the roster spot for the potential opportunities that will open up later. I want to take advantage of what the best overall plays are in these early games, but I don't want to fill my lineups with extra guys just because they are there. And you can kind of curate a player pool that is specifically intended to maximize the best plays in the early games while leaving as many roster spots open as possible. I think these are all sound strategies. Again, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every single slate about the best way to do this. I think there's strengths and weaknesses to each of these. I think a lot of it depends on how kind of concrete and extreme you want to be about this. If you want to make sure that no matter what, you always have 3 roster spots available in a lineup to late swap, you may be best off setting that rule and saying that you want that. If you kind of just want to preserve some late swap flexibility overall, maybe you're better off curating the player pool a little bit, removing some of the extras in the early games, and going from there. And if there's a particular game in question where there could be a lot of value on the slate, especially on a slate where there's not a lot of value to begin with, which isn't really the situation tonight. There's a ton of value. But let's say there was no really good value. Maybe the best overall projected play at lock was like 6x value, and there was a big, ominous, questionable tag hanging over LeBron James's name. Maybe the strategy of bumping up the Lakers projections would be the best way to go about it. All of this, I think, can be pretty sharp strategy, especially when applied correctly and on the right slate and in the right way. The one thing you should be aware of is that you can absolutely lose doing this, right? You are taking a gamble that an event is going to pay off for you, and you are probably going to get a massive ownership edge and a massive lineup construction edge when it does. But if you don't get that payoff, if those questionable players don't end up out, you're likely to have built suboptimally for that slate. So I would say it is also a little bit of a riskier strategy. If you are already a more risk-averse player, if you find yourself bringing down your exposures to players and in general, playing a little bit more of a risk-averse strategy, you may not want to do this because this is increasing your risk. It's probably increasing your upside as well, but it's definitely increasing your risk. So, but cool. All right, let's keep it going. And then, okay, we get into a couple questions here that I think are good opportunities to do some demos in the entry editor. I see it looks like YouTube chat is popping here as well. A lot of questions coming in YouTube. So we will get to everything today. I'm going to get through the questions that came in Slack before the start of the stream first. This one also came from Larson. He said, if I'm entering more than one single entry contest, but they have roughly the same field size, how do I create optimal lineups for each, not overlap with the same lineup and populate them into the entries? I was thinking about running one single entry build, but ask the system to give me 3 lineups from that build and enter them, but I can't figure out how to get each one unique. Yeah, so what you'll want to do there is use a unique fill from our entry editor. So if you go over to the entry editor, I'm going to assume just from the beginning here, I'm going to basically assume you don't have knowledge of the entry editor from the beginning here. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But just for those of you that are unfamiliar with this, this is a great tool. Very, very helpful to help manage your entries themselves. And it will save a lot of time and reduce the risk of making a mistake when you're fiddling around with Excel and trying to get your lineups right before lock, especially in a time-sensitive sport like NBA. So you come over here on DK, we make this as easy as possible. If you just click download template file from DraftKings, we will go straight to DraftKings and download your entries file. From there, you can just drag it in, and we will get all of the entries loaded for the particular slate you are looking at. So I have a handful of single entries here tonight, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I play the same way you do here, Larson. I will probably want a unique entry into each of these contests. So what I need is I need a 5 lineup build to get a unique lineup into each of these, right? Or 5 lineups from the same build. So if we go back to this test build here, right? We will never duplicate a lineup within the same build. There will never be a duplicate, right? That mostly comes from the fact that this min uniques by default is 1, right? That is saying each lineup must have at least 1 player different from each other. So every lineup in a given build will always be unique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set this to 5, right? Had you started with a fresh build, setting your lineup to 5 here is essentially the same thing as setting your lineups to 5 here. That does the same thing, right? But we're just going to get 5 lineups. And then we go back to the entries tab. And then what I need to do is I basically need to checkbox what contests am I going to fill here. So in this case, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are my 5 single entries. And then I'll click fill contest with lineups. And then there are 2 methods to filling uniquely, right? I'm going to take this 5 lineup set and I want to fill a unique lineup into each. The 2 options are random, which is very simple. A random lineup from our set of 5 is going to be put into each of these while still filling uniquely. Rank is basically going to use the highest overall Saber score, the number 1 ranked lineup, and put that into the lineup, the contest that is at the top. And then the Daily Dollar would have gotten the 2nd best lineup. The High Five gets the 3rd. The Elbow Shot gets the 4th. And the Mini Leaderboard gets the 5th. So you can do things like sorting by buy-in, right? Oh, that's a bug. I just noticed there. That does not retain the checked lineups correctly. But anyway, you can sort by buy-in here. And for example, fill by rank. And it will fill a unique lineup in this order into each of these contests. So let me know if that helps. Okay, and then very quick question here that Andrew had asked. I think I'll just quickly mention this. He said, basically, why can't I drag and drop and sort? And that is, if I remember correctly, just a technical limitation of the library that we're actually using to power this table. I know it's a little bit annoying. So if you sort a column by ascending or descending order or any of these, the drag and drops will go away. So at the moment, it is either or. You can drag and drop and put these in the order that you want like this, or you can sort by a column. So yeah, I know it's a little annoying at the moment, but okay, cool. Good question from Kick to the Head here about leverage. And this is actually something that, well, I'll read the question first. He said, I watched a video a while back regarding the leverage column. I came away both in awe and confused. In layman terms, can you explain, for example, if Sidney Crosby in my research build shows at the bottom with the most negative leverage and I have 0 exposure, does that mean in simple terms I would be fading the field? Whereas if he was at the top with the most positive leverage and I had 80% exposure, I'm running with the field at an 80% clip. I'm just trying to wrap my head around in simple terms how best to use SaberSim for ownership/leverage ideas. So this leverage column at the moment the name I think is confusing, to be completely honest. What it is actually doing is it is a very simple calculation. It is simply the exposure you have to a player. It is the percentage of lineups in your set that have that player in it minus the projected ownership of how many lineups we expect in the contest to have that player in it. So 61.8% Spencer Dinwiddie leverage. That means you have 61.8% more lineups than the field does with Dinwiddie in it, assuming that this number is accurate, basically. All it is in a typical build is it is descriptive of your lineups. It is not recommending a strategy, right? So, for example, we already have a 100% exposure to Spencer Dinwiddie, but 60% leverage on Trey Lyles, our second highest leverage play for our set of 20 lineups, is not recommending to you that you get more exposure. It is purely saying this is your relative exposure to the field for this set of lineups at the moment. I think because we have called this leverage, we have confused people, because leverage elsewhere in the industries is often a strategic, it is a suggestive term essentially of saying you should take this action because of this number. And that's not really what it is here. So we are actually probably going to end up changing this to say something like field plus minus, because that's actually what it is. It is just saying the difference of your exposure to the field. And I think we are confusing people because they see this number and they think, oh, I should do something on this. Like even on the negative side, right? People will look at this and say, oh, Jalen Brunson is the biggest negative leverage play, so he's the best fade on the slate. And clearly the builder thinks that Jalen Brunson is a good fade at this point in time, but this specific number is more about saying what you're currently doing with that set of lineups. Like this is what's actually happening here. So that is what leverage does when you are building your lineups. There is a specific nuance here. When you get to research builds, or specifically builds that are run at like the 0010 settings that I use for research, if you have a question about that, kick to the head, let me know. I think part of the problem too is that I explain what the leverage column is, but then also a very specific part of my strategy with the research builds in the same breath all too often. So I'm going to leave them separate today, because I think what part of the problem is that I confuse people by the way that I describe the research builds at times. That is what leverage is. So I'm going to leave it there. If you have a question about the research build specifically, let me know and we'll return to this. But I think it will help separating these two out in the future, because I think I'm leading to some of this confusion too because of the way that I talk about the leverage column. So that is what the leverage does. That is what leverage is. It is descriptive of your lineups at that point in time. So, okay. And then a good question from Reed here. And he said, is there a way to increase player pool without increasing the sim variance slider? There are a handful of ways. I would probably argue that increasing the sim variance slider is probably the best way to do it, because what's going to happen when you want to increase your player pool, right? You are increasing the diversity of your lineups, right? You are essentially saying that you want to account for a wider range of outcomes, right? If a player is an elite play that you are getting 100% exposure to, right? And that is soaking up a lot of lineup equity in your constructions, and that is decreasing your player pool, at least at that position, because that player is in 100% of your lineups in that particular spot. Reducing that player's exposure, right, to 50% would increase your player pool. That would lower your risk. That would increase the diversity of your lineups. But strategically, what is being implied there is that you want to allow for some more variance in the range of outcomes, right? That you're accepting that player does not, even if they are an elite play, they don't have 100% chance of being in the optimal lineup, and you want to kind of increase the percent chance that other players are successful in that lineup position, right? That is essentially what happens as you increase the sim variance slider. You are going to be looking at a smaller set of simulations for each individual lineup, essentially widening the range of outcomes for each player on the slate, right? So, as you approach like sim variance 10 here, even the best projected plays on the slate are going to have disappointing games. They're going to have games where they're not in the winning lineup or the optimal lineup, right? And you allow, if you pull a set of simulations or a single simulation where that happens, that player won't show up in the lineup, right? And you will increase the diversity of your lineups. You will increase the size of your player pool in a way that is very natural, that is associated with the actual outcomes of the game, and also increases your raw upside. So I know this says without increasing your sim variance slider, so I'll talk about a couple ways you can do it without touching the sim variance slider, but I think the best practice way to increase the diversity of your lineups would be to increase the sim variance slider. But let's assume for one reason or another that you don't want to do that. A couple other options. I think one is increasing the min uniques here, right? Basically telling the builder that there has to be a greater number of different players when comparing any two lineups together will naturally increase the size of your player pool, or at least move you in that direction. So I think increasing this to 2 or even 3, I probably wouldn't go beyond 3 just because that starts to put a lot of stress on the builder to find good lineups. But increasing this to 2 or 3 can be a good way of doing that. And then finally, I think the last thing you can do is to just manage your exposures in step 3. Reducing your exposure to the highest exposed players in your lineup pool will generally increase the size of your player pool. Actually, it by definition has to increase the size of your player pool as you move along. And I guess a little bit out of order here, but I think this would probably be my second favorite way of doing this, right? My favorite way, if you told me just straight up, I want to increase the size of my player pool, I want more diversity, I would say increase the sim variance slider. And you say, no, I don't want to do that, then I would say second best, decrease your maximum exposure to your highest plays in step 3, right? Watch the size of the player pool here, right? Can you guys see that okay? Let me zoom this in a little bit. Watch this number as we slowly, yeah, it looks like that's pretty clear. As we slowly cap our max exposures to players in our pool, right? So we started at 25. Cap 50, Spencer Dinwiddie. 26. Cap Obi Toppin, 250%. Still 26. It's taking a minute here. 27 as we capped, who was that? Harrison Barnes to 50%. Let's cap, here, let me go back. Let's cap Tyus Jones to 50%. 31 players in our player pool, right? And this makes sense intuitively. As you are capping the exposure to the best overall plays in your pool, the new players that are being introduced in those lineups that are kind of filling in the gaps must include other players, right? They can't come from anywhere else. They have to be other names. We've increased our player pool by setting a maximum exposure to 50% within our given build. We jumped from 25 players to 37 players in our pool. That would also be another really good way of doing it. What's nice about this approach, excuse me, is that you're pulling a pool of 20 lineups from a set of 500 lineups that were already optimized for this contest. So you know that the lineups are going to be very good, no matter what. All you're doing is kind of tamping down your risk here a little bit. I think the third way of doing it would be adjusting the mid uniques. That's probably my least favorite way of adjusting or trying to get more diversity into your lineups, just because it's very brute force. It's a rule. It's like it's essentially a restriction on the builder. In this case, you allowed the builder to build unrestricted, and you're just saying, I like these 20 instead of the original 20 at the top here. And by increasing your sim variance slider, you aren't restricting the builder. You are just looking at a wider range of outcomes for players. So, cool. All right. We're cruising here. Question from JWH. And this is the last question that came in Slack before the start of the stream. So we'll answer this, then we'll hop over to YouTube chat and get all the questions that have come in live there. Then we'll go back to Slack and hit the other questions that have come in since the start of the stream in Slack. So JWH says, question for today. We often talk about avoiding duplication. Do you have any tips as far as avoiding duplication in GPPs with other SaberSim members? I'm sort of thinking this may just be the byproduct of honing in on your own individual process, but was curious. Really good question. And I find it funny. This question always comes in exactly in this way. And it is specifically about avoiding duplication with other SaberSim members. To that question specifically, I think most of the time that is solved by virtue of the sim variance slider, right? Even at lower levels, you can actually experiment with this for yourself. Even at anything above 0, basically, even at sim variances of 1, 2, or 3, because you are randomly grouping sets of simulations from a set of 10,000 simulations of each game, you are unlikely to duplicate with other SaberSim users apart from contests where apart from sport types or contests where your risk of being duplicated by the field in general is already high, right? On a traditional optimizer, if you were just building without any randomness at all, you would get the same lineups every single time you build. You can actually go in and test this out, especially for like an 11-game NBA main slate. If you build after build after build at the same settings, you will get different lineups each time, which means that other SaberSim users are also getting different lineups each time, which is a good thing. DFS is a high variance game. There are very small, thin lines of expected value between the overall best lineups that you can play. And honestly, any tool out there that prints the exact same lineups every single time you press build is, from my perspective, arguing that those lineups are better than they are, that they are some objective best lineups that you can play based on the inputs that you gave the system, when that's not really the case. SaberSim kind of understands that and will kind of give you a different set of lineups that are all approximately equal in expected value every single time. It's really cool, actually. With that said, duplication is still important, right? Don't want to ignore duplication, but the risk of being duplicated or the concern about duplication is something that you should worry about in certain sports, period, not from the lens of trying to avoid duplicating other SaberSim users, right? You either are concerned about duplication in that particular sport or contest type, or you are not. And it's not so much about avoiding dupes with other users. It's about avoiding dupes in the contest, period. Typically, I would say a decent rule of thumb for asking yourself, do I need to be concerned with duplication for this particular contest? And this is a very general rule of thumb, is looking at what the default sim variance slider is, right? If the default sim variance slider is 10 for the contest and the slate that you are playing, you are using a single game simulation or a single slate or single event simulation for that particular event to build that lineup, which basically means you are looking at the thinnest range of outcomes possible. Optimal lineups for that contest are from a single game simulation, right? Because of that, you are more likely to be duplicated in that contest because there are less viable lineups that can just purely be played, period, right? We could do a quick kind of like case study of this, right? So NBA main slate, let's look at 20 max 10 to 50Ks, right? Probably not at a very high risk of being duplicated. NBA showdown. Hang on. NBA showdown, risk of duplication. Default value is sim variance 10. Right, let's go ahead. This is not a perfect rule of thumb. You will see in situations like for something like the NFL Millie Maker, an enormous NFL contest, right? Sim variance is going to be 10. The odds of being truly duped in a contest like that are probably still pretty low, maybe a little bit higher, right? But if you go into something like MMA, let's look at default settings for MMA. Sim variance 10. Risk of duplication, right? I think that's a very good, decent rule of thumb for overall. When do I need to worry about duplication? Now, what can we do? Let's assume, for example, let's go back to an NBA showdown example and say we are trying to avoid duplication in a sport or a contest type where we've identified it is important. What are some ways to avoid that? So this, again, is something that I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. I typically like to think about what is the field going to think about this game, right? And really kind of think about it from the lens of like the actual game being played. How is the field going to play this particular contest? And I will look at things like the Vegas spread and total and get a sense of, especially in football showdowns, who does the field think is going to win the game? By what margin does the field think the winning team is going to win by? And what's the overall total going to be? right? Is it going to be a higher or lower scoring game? For NBA, I think totals matter a little bit less, but I do still like to look at the spread and the favorite in the game. And I also look at the big names, right? What are the big names playing in that game? And the reason why I like to do that is because I typically find, I'm just going to build these here and then we'll come back. I'm going to talk about the build settings too. I have typically found that even if the most likely outcome on tonight's slate is that the Sixers win by 3.5 points, and that the most likely to be optimal captains are LeBron James, Joel Embiid, and James Harden, right? Just as a hypothetical, that's kind of just what I expected to see here. The field will almost always overrate the probability of those events happening. And you can actually see that even just in a build of 500 lineups for a 20 max build, there's probably a lot more diversity in here than what the field thinks there is, right? So we can, for example, eliminate lineups where the captain is a big name, right? And because we're using simulations to build these lineups, we know that what is left, the best 20 lineups that are now remaining, still have an associated single game simulation for which that lineup is optimal, right? That's kind of the key point here. So we are reducing duplication and probably sacrificing virtually no expected value. Another thing you can do, and one thing that I like to do here, is to actually go into the stacks and flip the common game script on its head. So in this case, I think that the field is actually going to think that this game is going to be probably pretty close. It's a nationally televised game. I know that the Lakers record maybe isn't all too great, but based on the fact that this is, I think it probably has a 3.5 or 4 point spread, two teams with big names, I think that the field is going to think that this is going to be a close game. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to experiment with the idea of playing no balanced builds here and basically try to shoot for a situation. And I'm even going to see if I can only do 5-1 stacks. Okay. So in this case, I can't do only 5-1 stacks, not with my original pool of 500 lineups. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, let's do 100% 4-2 stacks. Oops. Hang on. Okay. 100% 4-2 stacks. And what we've done here is we've said, of the pool of 500 lineups that we said were optimal for this particular slate, I'm going to eliminate some captains that I think are going to be popular, right? And I'm going to eliminate some lineup constructions that I think are going to be popular and will have very well likely reduced my chance of being duplicated in this particular set of lineups. This is not something that I think, again, is a one-size-fits-all. I don't think you can always take this approach. In something like MMA, it's a kind of a more complicated problem. To deal with the problem of duplication, you don't have the captain spot, at least not for the main slates. I think you have to be a little more creative in that particular sport of how you're going to deal with that. But for showdowns, which I think are the most classic example of avoiding duplication, I think those are my two favorite approaches. And I like to limit my captain pool or remove some captains that I think are going to be overly popular relative to their chance of success, and to flip what I think are going to be the popular lineup constructions on their head as well. So, but the final point, or I guess kind of circling back to the original point here, and maybe the most important one, is that duplication is either something you need to worry about for that particular contest and slate type, or it isn't. It is not something that you need to worry about specifically avoiding duplication from other SaberSim users, because sim variance already takes that into account. If you are worried about duping other SaberSim users, you should be much more worried about duping all the other players in your contest and figuring out how you're going to deal with that, not how you're going to avoid printing the duplicate lineup from some other random SaberSim user. Brad actually makes an interesting point here. He says, look at our contest we've done in the league. So for those of you that don't know, there's a SaberSim league on DraftKings where there's kind of I think it's like been a 10 or 20 person contest every single night. Brad says there has not been a single dupe yet amongst SaberSim users. And that I'm not surprised. Just given, again, we're talking about an enormous pool of simulations here. That even amongst everybody building lineups with SaberSim is probably going to have a similar kind of, I would say, set of exposures. If you don't make any adjustments, the players that your lineups like are going to be similar amongst other users. But your chance of being duplicated in an NBA Classic slate amongst other SaberSim users is pretty low, provided that it's more than just a handful of games. So anyway, enough on that. let's keep it going. All right, let's jump over to YouTube chat and get to these questions that have come in the start of the stream here. Cool. T said, is there a way to create a blank build? If we go lineup by lineup, we can move certain lineups to the blank build to separate them while going through the review process. Thanks. So at the moment, there is no way to add lineups to a build. You can't basically take a lineup from a build and send it to another build. We've talked about what that might look like as a potential feature in the future. One thing that you can do that I think is actually kind of cool is I'm going to reset all of my exposures here to just get this build back to normal. If you wanted to take this approach, you can, and I've actually kind of experimented with certain slates. So you can put the exposures away, right? Just look at your lineups and then change. I wonder if it'll actually let me do this. I don't think it'll let me do 0. You can change your number of lineups to 1 here, right? So that'll just leave one lineup in. But then instead go into your pool and just look at your lineups and add the lineups to the set yourself. So if you're only playing a handful of lineups, or especially if you're not like playing, 150 or something like that, I definitely know there are users out there that like this approach to lineup. I don't even want to say construction, to building out your pool of lineups. Instead of, building the pool and adjusting exposures, you want to look at individual lineups and kind of cherry pick them in. You can do this. And you can say, you're going through and looking for, I've actually experimented with this quite a bit for things like NFL Showdown. Maybe you're looking for lineups that have either under 200% cumulative ownership, or a unique captain, or some other thing that's kind of catching your eye. Maybe a particularly low salary build. We'll see. I'm just kind of looking through and picking a few of these because maybe they stand out. Here's a low salary build, right? There's another low salary build. And maybe you're kind of picking in lineups like that. That would be one way to do it. Now, you can't send these lineups to different builds, but you can kind of assemble your own lineup set piece by piece by taking that approach to it instead, by looking through your pool and checking lineups that you want to play in as an alternative to, not even an alternative, as just kind of a different way of using step 3. Let me know if that helps. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but I think that's kind of cool. So Craig said, hey, Jordan, how long for the Halliburton revenge game narrative sim? Oh, I haven't even really looked at the slate too much from that point of view, but forgot about that. That's fun. Is he playing? He's questionable. Sabonis is out, right? So we don't get the Sabonis side of it. Yeah. I love that. I wonder, it'd be an interesting thought experiment, especially I'm curious to see how big this number is compared to what we project. And it might not be that much higher on an 11-game slate. A lot of people, as much as I like to make fun of the narratives and things like that, a lot of people are using projections and optimizers now. And if Halliburton doesn't project that well tonight, I don't think he's going to be too out of control, but it would be an interesting kind of thought experiment to see if we can quantify that narrative ownership boost. This is just a really low average projection, which could just be us, but I'm curious to see how high he goes. So, and Buddy Hield too. Yeah. Okay. Jonathan says, why does SaberSim sometimes suggest me build lineups with 100% exposure to some stars? For example, on Monday, I had 100% exposure to Luka and ended up busting. Even if Luka played well, I don't think this is optimal. Do you think it's better to not be over, say, 100% on some of the chalky star players? I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that, where you can say it is objectively wrong to have 100% exposure to a player, right? Obviously, if Luka was $3,000 min price, it would absolutely be optimal to roster him in 100% of your lineups, right? At the actual salaries we have for these players, the more realistic salaries, right? There's essentially kind of there's a break point at which it would no longer be optimal to roster 100% of a player. And on a certain slate, based on the way other value options show up, what positional options are available at different positions, sometimes that breakpoint won't be reached, and the builder will think it is optimal to play 100% exposure to one player. Now, obviously, we understand that no player has literally a 100% chance of success, right? It is kind of a measured risk based on how high your sim variance slider is, right? Actually, really all of your sliders. how different players correlate to one another in the lineup, what the ownership projections of a player are, what their ranges of outcomes look like, and what other salaries and positions are available for how your lineups end up getting constructed. Obviously, it also depends on how many lineups you are playing, right? There's a very different. Actually, we can just demo this. There is something very different about 100% exposure to a player in 3 lineups versus 20 lineups versus 150 lineups. And that's actually also something that the builder will kind of by its nature understand. I'll show you this here real quickly. So I'm going to reset all exposures here. And you can actually kind of see, so 100% Spencer Dinwiddie tonight, right? Kind of similar to the Luka situation, actually, right? As we increase this to 150 lineups, so there is essentially, of the first 150 lineups for this particular build, only 141 of them where Dinwiddie is optimal. As you increase this more and more, right? Just out of curiosity, that will continue to go down. So from a practical standpoint, because I realize that the theoretical side of this maybe isn't super helpful, ultimately, your exposures to a player are going to be a measure of your own risk tolerance, right? If we look, let's say you were using this actual build to come up with a set of, with a set of 20 lineups that you were going to take with you into your contest, right? Dinwiddie himself is only showing up in 60% of them. There are 200 lineups of the entire set of 500 that don't even have Dinwiddie in them, right? You could actually afford to fully fade Dinwiddie in this particular set of lineups, and you would still very easily have a set of 20 that you could take with you here. So ultimately, the question of exposure is trying to take the slate context, what contest you tell us you are playing, and how many lineups you are building, and say that these are the best overall lineups that you could play. But the range of outcomes of any given player and the true diversity of the lineups in your pool, I would typically make me feel comfortable saying that you should lower the exposure for any player on any slate to a level you are comfortable with. This question, to me, reads like you would rather be maximally 80% exposed to any one player, which is perfectly fine. And that's why this is designed the way it is. I'm not going to be able to tell you, even on a particular slate, if it is objectively optimal to lower your exposure to different players in different situations, right? There's too much context that is kind of, I think, being missed there. But you can see here, very easy. I mean, about 20 minutes ago, I gave an example of reducing every player to 50% exposure, and the builder had no problem whatsoever doing that. So in basketball, right? I guess one other thing I'll mention on this. In basketball, part of the reason why I'm generally comfortable having extremely high exposure to particular players is because their percent chance of success is pretty high, right? Let's go back to Dinwiddie here and look at him real quick. So we can look at it just for the standpoint of the percentiles, right? His 25th percentile outcome, the outcome that he hits 75% of the time, or meets or exceeds 75% of the time, is 34.5 points, which is a 5.4x event, right? So he is, I hate this term. I don't even like the way this is going to come out of my mouth, but he is meeting that value line at his 25th percentile, that 5x value, right? His range of outcomes is generally pretty kind to compared to his overall salary, even at a very high ownership projection. We can draw a contrast here to something like baseball, where a very high mean projected hitter may be 30% owned. But that player's range of outcomes will almost always be that their most common outcome is actually 0, right? So in basketball, I'm pretty comfortable having a ton of exposure to the best overall projected plays, or even, you're rarely going to see Luka projected for 7x, right? But if Luke was projected for 5.5x, which he is going to be sometimes, especially if there's a lot of value at other positions or something like that, I'm totally fine having 100% exposure. But that's my personal risk tolerance. And there's certainly nothing wrong with bringing that down as you see fit. So looks like there's kind of an interesting back and forth conversation here overall. Yeah, so interesting conversation going on there. Happy to kind of come back to this a little bit, but I'm going to continue to move on to some other questions here in the meantime. I did see, so it looks like there was some consensus here, thinking about playing no more than 80% of any chalky star that SaberSim really likes, some rule like that, wondering what Jordan thinks about this. I will say, if you are interested, I am more comfortable being extremely heavily exposed to lower salary elite values than chalky, slightly higher projected expensive plays, right? Like, I would be much more happy with 100% exposure to Obi Toppin tonight than I would be with 100% to Joel Embiid. Now, that does not mean that I am going to just scratch 100% exposure to Joel Embiid. I may still play that. But you compare, right? And we weren't getting 100% Joel Embiid, but there is a clear difference. Look at the difference between here. Let's do it by salary and remove players. Okay, so amongst other players that have a similar salary to Joel Embiid, right, we can see that the 95th percentile for these players is, I would say, like within kind of a reasonable distance, right? I think no one would probably disagree if I said that of these first 5 names that show up here, everyone's 95th percentile, essentially their ceiling, is around 70-ish, 75 points, right? For LeBron, KD, Durant, Trae Young, and DeJounte Murray, right? But if we instead go down to, let's go down all the way to some of these low salary guys, right? Where is, I'm looking specifically to see, what is Obi Toppin's salary? He's 3,400. So let's go down to the 3,400 guys. Okay. Look at the difference between so there are also some other good values down here as well, but look, I guess, that the difference between the 95th percentile amongst some of the lower values here for a guy like Toppin, right? There's just like a clear, in terms of, 27 is, let's see, 27 fantasy points. Wait, I'm losing track. I'm seeing too many numbers here. 27 fantasy points is 70% of 38 fantasy points, right? At the high end, even if we take Kevin Durant, which is the lowest 95th percentile we have up here, 68 is 86% of 79, right? For a player that has a massively different value at the average than Joel Embiid, right? So Kevin Durant's high-end ceiling is 86% of what Joel Embiid's is. In a typical test build, you might have 0% Kevin Durant and 80% Joel Embiid. Whereas for Obi Toppin, the closest other player around him has 66% of his 95th percentile, right? So for those reasons, I am more comfortable managing my risk and bringing down my exposure to the higher projected chalky plays that you might be getting rather than the lower salary, better value chalky plays that you're getting. So anyway, we'll move on here. Brad says the ownership projection, is that just an average projection across all contests, or where does that number come from? Just curious, as last night Toppin was 85th in one contest or around 60 in another. Yeah, so this ownership projection is basically, it is a projection of a large field GPP, right? Think probably the flagship contest or something like the Minimax on DK any given night, right? A big, large field GPP. Ownership will condense in different contests. It will condense in smaller contests for 2 reasons. One, in smaller contests, people generally play safer. They will latch onto what the field believes to be the best projected plays on the slate a little bit more. Also, sharper players take up more equity in contests which generally means ownership in smaller contests will condense onto the best plays a little bit more. Ownership also condenses as you move up in stakes. Higher stakes players generally have a sense of how they can find the best plays a little more easier, or what is perceived to be the best plays a little bit easier. So you'll see some ownership condensing as you move up in stakes as well. So this is really kind of large field ownership projections. It is difficult in a lot of ways to project how ownership will condense in different sized contests. We have kicked around the idea of having ownership that sizes differently based on the contest you tell us you're building lineups for. But when you start talking about ownership condensing, the risk is very high, right? There is saying Spencer Dinwiddie is going to be the highest owned player in large field GPPs at about 35% owned is one thing. Trying to project if he is going to be 50% or 75% or 80% in a variety of different contests is a different beast entirely. It's a bit of a harder problem to solve. So these should be treated as large field GPP ownership projections. Too Short says, when late swapping, should I drop the min salary to 49,000 or keep it 49.5? I think it is a decent rule of thumb. Well, I find myself dropping my min salary as I'm late swapping throughout the slate, mostly just to avoid a situation where a late swap fails later in the slate, because you can't swap somebody in at the min salary. I don't think this is ultimately going to matter too much in either direction, to be completely honest. I think like either the builder is going to be able to find a swap or it isn't. And if it can't, then you should come back and adjust the min salary down. I think it's totally fine to drop it to something. I think 49.5 is a little high personally. Even on an 11-game slate, that feels a little high. I'd probably be a little more comfortable just being here anyway, period. And I think dropping it as the slate goes along so that the builder can continue to find the best lineup possible without being restricted too much by salary is a fine strategy. I think that makes some sense. So 12-pack says, when the slider settings are backtested, is the benchmark pure win equity, top 1%, or something else? It is expected. Actually, I think it is actual value, because at that point the actual scores are known. So it is the actual value when compared to a historical contest or a slate that actually ran that set of lineups would have produced. It is like average actual value of the lineup. So like if a lineup, if we build 10,000 lineups on a certain set of settings, we can see what the actual scores of those lineups were, compare them to a past contest that ran, and determine what the highest sliders, what set of sliders built the highest actual value set of lineups. And then to smooth out the variance, we do that process. I don't know what the actual number is. I assume many, many times for one slate, and then also do that for many different slates. So, Stanley asks a good question here. Do the actual ownerships for locked games get pulled in for late swap? They do not. So there is no. Someone asked me the other day if it makes sense to go in and change the ownership projections for players whose games have already started to what they actually are in your contests. At the moment, there is no advantage. There's no reason to do that. Once a player is locked into your lineups and the slate has started and you're late swapping, the builder does not care that player is in the lineup at all. If you increase that player's ownership to 100, it does not attempt to get less ownership in the rest of the lineup. The builder is purely rebuilding the remaining lineup spots that are left available. So, good question. Brad says, when can we get Sims on the Madden Sims? You just got to buy Madden. Just sim it on your own console. You just run that thing. Just have the computer play itself in the background, like, I don't know, 100 times throughout the day while you're at work, and then just write down the results each time, and there's your Sims. There's your edge. I still am a little. I definitely get that. Like I think it was a interesting diversion during COVID, but I am astonished that there are real money DFS contests for Madden Sims every night. I like can't. It's crazy to me, but okay. A couple questions that I missed in Slack. This one's from Six Fever here, or actually it looks like it's via average Call of Duty player. And he said, does anyone change the sliders that much when building lines? I build throughout the day to see who the opto likes. I play single entry mostly, and the correlation is normally set to high. But how important is correlation really? Sorry, I got distracted. The default values for the sliders are generally going to be best for you. I don't think there's a lot of value in making adjustments here, mostly because we have done. I don't want to say they are perfect. We change the sliders. We change the default values of the sliders on occasion when we run new backtests and think that based on how our models have changed, that it's better to change them or based on different things like that. So there can be some opportunity here, but this isn't a high value add part of the process, mostly just because of how much work has been done ahead of time to optimize for these. So I would say without a very good reason to make an adjustment here, right? Basically, anytime somebody says, should I change the sliders? I say no. Because a lot of the work of determining what the optimals are has already been done ahead of time. If there's a specific reason, right? Let me give you an example. Sometimes, there are questions that come in like, I've adjusted ownership projections based on what I think is specifically going to happen in my single entry because I play this contest every single night. Then I think there's a good argument to be made of increasing the ownership fade slider maybe by a tick, right? Get a little bit of extra value out of the work that you put in to adjust the ownership projections, right? That's a good example. For the correlation specifically, yes, correlation is going to show up as high for NBA, especially an 11-game slate for most of these contests here, right? I think it's generally going to be about 5 or 6. And that is valuing correlation at a relatively high level. However, correlations in NBA are not very strong. The maximum correlation you're probably generally going to see for most players is a negative correlation of about negative 0.15-ish max. Mostly what the correlation slider is going to do is it's going to avoid combinations of players that occupy a similar role on the same team and make sure that you don't have like 2 very similar players from the same team in the same game or the same lineup, and don't have too many players from the same team overall. So like even at correlation 10, it doesn't have an enormous impact on your NBA lineups because those correlations themselves are not very high. You compare that to something like NFL. If you turn correlation to 10, the builder is playing with correlations that are like 0.4 to 0.5 sometimes, and you will get at times like enormous stacks. If you do something like that, or baseball, right, where correlations individual in between player correlations in baseball are not super high. They're like 0.15 ish to like 0.2, but every player in the lineup is positively correlated to one another, so that builds on itself really fast. If you do correlation 10 for baseball, you'll get like 100% 4 4s and 5 3s. So anyway, to answer that kind of question here, correlation is not highly important in NBA. On a larger slate, we can take advantage of it a little bit more and use it as a useful tool. But because the individual correlations between different players are relatively low and negative, it doesn't have a huge lineup construction impact on your lineups. So Stanley says, wouldn't the actual ownership from the locked-in games be beneficial in determining ownership for later games? Yes, it would. Yeah. So I do think that is a potential spot to add value. If you download the CSV, so you can download the contest CSV as the slate's going on and see the ownership of all the different players that are currently playing. If you study that and, you can kind of see ahead of time where there may be an ownership inefficiency, right? Like, just at the top end, let's say who's playing in this early game. Let's say that in the first games that lock right at start, you actually get 25% on Trae Young, right? Now going in and telling the builder that, hey, Trae Young's actually 25% owned won't change anything about the lineups that you have that already have Trae Young locked into it. But if you can kind of reason from there that, hey, this might actually be 10 per 10, and this might actually be 15, that will add value because we will use these numbers instead as we late swap DeJounte Murray and James Harden in and out of your remaining lineup spots accordingly. So players that are locked in to your lineups already, changing their ownership has no effect. But if you use that information and adjust ownership of players that have yet to play, that can have value. So. Craig said, I made a mistake yesterday and ended up with Kuminga and Looney in all of my 50 lineups into the mini-max. They were 3% and 4% owned for late swap for the rest of the slate. I turned my ownership fade to 0 since I already had 2 low-owned guys in my lineup. Yeah, I think that's fine too. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So, okay. Question from Banamy here, I think is how it's said. Will grouping in MLB be viable? I don't think you need to do it. Frankly, I don't think there will be a very strong case for it. Mostly just because of the correlation data that we have from our Sims, you get well-constructed lineups to begin with, right? You'll find that it's the combination of all the sliders. It's that the correlation data, knowing the simulations themselves, and taking into account ownership, you often just without doing anything get really nice looking lineups that have I call them like a major stack, your minor stack, 2 pitchers in the case of DraftKings. A lot of times you're not chalky everywhere, right? Like either a low-owned major stack or a low-owned minor stack or a low-owned pitcher or some combination of all those things. I don't know. At the moment, can't think of anything that I would want to group out for baseball that isn't already done by default. That may change, but I guess I will see as we get closer. But last season, prior to us adding groups, there were situations in football and basketball where at times I would have thought it would have been nice to have a player group that I could make here if I so chose. I don't think I've ever had that thought playing baseball with SaberSim. Viable, sure. I don't want to say it's unviable. I'm sure someone could come up with a creative group or a reasoning for a group that, would make sense to me. But I don't think there's nothing that I'm planning on using groups for baseball for now. So HC said, am I buying MLB The Show 22? I might once baseball season gets started up. Mostly just sometime around the middle of the summer, I always kind of start having an urge to play Road to the Show, just because I think it's fun. But I don't know. Well, I got it last year and I didn't enjoy it as much. I don't know. We'll see. See how it shakes out. All right. Cool. I think we managed to get through everything here today. Thank you, everybody that tuned in, asked questions, participated. Thank you to everybody that watches and listens to this show once it goes up as a recording on YouTube as well. We'll go ahead and leave it there. It was a fun stream today. We talked about all kinds of stuff, really. We were all over the place. So it was a fun one. This is our last stream of the week for Office Hours for this week. So taking a couple days off here. We'll be right back at it on Monday of next week. So see you guys next week. Enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you then. So good luck on your contest tonight. Have fun with the 11-game craziness, and see you next week. Take care.